Please subscribe to my channel and like my video. Thank you for your support. The enslavement of demonic powers. The nightmare of Toronto. It was the coldest time of winter in Toronto. A snowstorm had blanketed the city in white. Claire and Mark Johnson, childhood sweethearts, were living a peaceful life. However, this winter evening would change their lives forever. Claire watched the dancing snowflakes from their large windows while Mark was in his study, eyes fixed on his monitor. That night, Claire suddenly woke up, gasping for breath. Her heart was racing, and she felt like someone was watching her. When she realized Mark was not beside her, her anxiety grew. She quietly went downstairs and found Mark sitting in the dark in the living room. His eyes were empty and expressionless. When Claire touched him, he jolted and came to his senses. "What's going on, Mark?" Claire asked, but Mark brushed it off, saying, "Just a nightmare, that's all." In the following days, Mark's behavior became even stranger. There was a peculiar glint in his eyes, as if something inside him was trying to break free. Claire grew increasingly worried as she watched her husband's transformation. Mark made strange noises in his sleep at night and remembered nothing in the mornings. One night, Claire was awakened by a horrifying scream. Mark was standing at the edge of the bed, his eyes completely black. Claire looked at him in terror, but Mark seemed not to recognize her. A few minutes later, Mark returned to normal and got back into bed. Claire decided to investigate further. While secretly searching Mark's study, Claire found an old book. The book was filled with ancient symbols and dark rituals. Claire shuddered when she realized Mark had been interested in this book. She understood that Mark's soul had been possessed by demonic powers through the book. Mark was becoming increasingly aggressive and dangerous. One night, Claire noticed Mark trying to harm her. She used all her strength to stop him and knocked him out. Claire knew she could no longer handle this situation on her own. Claire decided to seek help from Dr. Eleanor Hayes, a renowned occult expert in Toronto. After listening to Claire, Dr. Hayes took the situation seriously and began preparing for an exorcism ritual. Meanwhile, Mark had completely lost control and become dangerous. Dr. Hayes, Claire, and a few assistants began the ritual. Mark was tied to the bed, and the demonic entity within him was resisting wildly. Dr. Hayes tried to weaken the demonic presence with holy water and prayers. Mark's body shook violently, and he spoke in strange tongues. Claire watched the terrifying scene in tears. After a long struggle, the demonic entity began to weaken. Mark let out an incredible scream and became completely still for a moment. Dr. Hayes declared that the entity had been fully expelled, and Mark's soul was free. After the ritual, Mark began to regain consciousness but remembered nothing. However, Claire felt that the dark energy in the house had not been completely eradicated. One day, Mark found the old book again and told Claire everything. He had bought the book from an antique dealer and unknowingly released the dark powers within it. Claire and Dr. Hayes started preparing the necessary rituals to completely destroy the demonic entity. However, they realized this time the dark forces were much stronger. Dark symbols began appearing in every room, on the walls and ceilings. Claire felt an evil presence in every corner of the house and knew this time it would be much harder. Dr. Hayes told Claire that the ritual would be much longer and more difficult this time. Claire kept an eye on Mark, who was tied to the bed. Mark's eyes turned black again. His body shook, and he made guttural, demonic sounds. Dr. Hayes prepared the holy water and prayers and began the ritual. As the ritual began, a terrifying energy rose within the house. The walls seemed to move as if alive, and shadows danced in the darkness. Dr. Hayes read her prayers loudly, sprinkling holy water on Mark. However, this time, the demonic entity resisted much more strongly within Mark's body. Mark's body twisted in incredible ways, the demonic entity causing him immense pain. Claire watched the horrifying scene in tears, but did not lose hope. Dr. Hayes intensified her prayers and felt the entity weakening for a moment. Suddenly, the energy in the room exploded, and the bottle of holy water in Dr. Hayes's hand shattered on the floor. With the holy water spilled, the demonic entity grew even stronger. Mark's body levitated and was violently thrown against the walls of the room. Claire retreated in fear, but Mark's agonized screams spurred her into action again. Dr. Hayes quickly grabbed another bottle of holy water and continued her prayers. However, this time, the demonic entity directly attacked Dr. Hayes. Shadows in the room swirled around her, trying to choke her. Claire gathered her courage and ran to Dr. Hayes, joining her prayers. Together, they formed a strong barrier against the demonic entity. After hours of struggle, Claire and Dr. Hayes felt the demonic entity weakening. They began to pray even louder and poured holy water on Mark. Mark's body calmed for a moment, but the entity still resisted. In a final effort, Dr. Hayes pressed the cross in her hand to Mark's forehead and began reciting her strongest prayers. Claire knew this was their last hope and joined the prayers with all her heart. The energy in the room reached its peak, and for a moment, everything went silent. With the sound of an explosion, the demonic entity left Mark's body and vanished within the room. Mark fell to the ground, motionless. Claire ran to Mark in tears and breathed a sigh of relief when she saw he was breathing. Dr. Hayes, exhausted but victorious, sank to the floor. After the ritual, Claire and Mark took some time to recover. Mark had completely forgotten the horrifying experience, but Claire remembered every detail. Dr. Hayes declared the house was completely cleansed and the demonic entity would not return. However, Claire carried the traces of this terrifying experience for the rest of her life. She felt the presence of darkness in every corner of the house. She and Mark decided to start anew and left Toronto. In another city, in a new house, they built a new life. But Claire knew this experience would never completely end. Darkness always lurked somewhere, and sometimes in the silence of the night, she felt the dark shadows still watching them. This was a turning point in their lives, and nothing would ever be the same again. The hardest time of Albert's life. Albert was going through the toughest period of his life. His beloved wife, Hannah, had died in a car accident, and Albert was devastated by her death. Every night, as he tossed and turned in his bed, he began to have nightmares. In his dreams, he relived that horrific moment of losing Hannah over and over again. One night, Albert woke up again from a sleep filled with nightmares. He was drenched in sweat and trembling. The darkness and silence of the room terrified him even more. He immediately turned on the night lamp beside him, lighting up his room. However, he felt that he could not fall back asleep after the dark shadow he had seen. In an attempt to escape his nightmares, Albert started seeing a psychologist. But no matter what he did, he couldn't rid himself of the nightmares. Every night, Hannah's screams echoed in his ears, keeping him awake. He no longer knew what to do. One night, Albert dreamt that he was with Hannah again, experiencing her death. This time, when he opened his eyes in the dream, he noticed a shadowy figure beside Hannah. This figure was approaching him, wanting to steal Albert's soul. In the morning, Albert woke up in his bed, drenched in sweat and trembling. As he watched the sunrise from his window, he recalled the terrifying moment he had experienced in his dream. This time, he knew it wasn't real, but the impact of that nightmare still lingered over him. Albert decided to fight his nightmares more determinedly. This time, he was ready to confront and accept Hannah's death. He would no longer let his nightmares control him. Every night when he went to bed, he no longer had nightmares and enjoyed a peaceful sleep. To honor Hannah's memory and say goodbye to her in peace, he had a tombstone made. Now he could sleep peacefully every night by talking to her. One day, a strange package arrived at Albert's house. There was no identification or sender information on the package. When Albert opened it, he found an old letter and an antique necklace inside. The necklace was adorned with strange symbols and markings. The letter read, "Dear Albert, you cannot escape your fears, because your nightmares are becoming reality. Wear the necklace, and you will see the truth." Albert was shocked by the mysterious message in the letter and, trembling, put the necklace around his neck. Suddenly, a strange light appeared around the room, and Albert felt as though he was in a different dimension. The surroundings were shrouded in mist, and a mysterious figure was approaching him. This figure looked like the ghost of Hannah, but darker and more frightening. Hannah's ghost approached Albert and began to deliver a message. "Albert, you must accept your nightmares. You cannot escape facing the truth. I am here to take revenge on you," she said. As Albert trembled with fear, he began to question whether the ghost of Hannah was real. Suddenly, a mechanical sound was heard, and everything vanished abruptly. Albert woke up in his bed, drenched in sweat, and found nothing unusual in his room. However, the necklace was still around his neck, and the letter was on the table. Confused about whether all he had experienced was a dream or reality, he began to read the letter. The letter read, "Dreams and nightmares are mirrors of reality. You must face your pains and fears. Only by accepting them and making peace with the past can you find peace." When Albert finished reading the letter, he decided to embrace and accept his fears and pains. Albert was now ready to face his nightmares and make peace with the past. He decided to take a step to confront Hannah's ghost and give her peace. Facing reality and making peace with his pains was the key to achieving true peace and inner tranquility for Albert. This mysterious event-filled experience would change his life forever. A haunting night. On a quiet night, Gabriella felt lost in the depths of the universe, unable to escape the loneliness and painful memories. Losing her husband had turned her life upside down. Whenever she wanted to distance herself from the house, darkness and solitude would envelop her when she closed her eyes. Unable to bear it any longer, Gabriella decided to pour out her fears by writing her own story. Losing her husband in a car accident was like a nightmare for Gabriella. She longed for every moment, every memory of him, and couldn't accept the reality. The silence of the house drove her mad. One night, as she waited in her dimly lit room, she suddenly heard a strange noise. At first, she ignored it, but as the sound repeated, her anxiety grew. The sound seemed to come from the depths of the room, as if someone was breathing. Gabriella held her breath and scanned the room, but saw nothing. Filled with fear, she looked under the bed and felt a hand touch her fingers. Her body froze, her heart pounded. When she reached under the bed with trembling hands, she felt a cold texture. With trembling hands, she pulled out a darkened notebook. The cover had a pale face on it, and as she gazed into its eyes, Gabriella suddenly felt drawn in. She opened the notebook with shaking hands and noticed the pages were stained and faded, as if they hadn't been used in years. As she flipped through the pages, she discovered it belonged to its previous owner and felt a deep sense of fear. The writings in the notebook were in her late husband's handwriting. In shock, Gabriella read through the pages and encountered a terrifying story with every line. Each sentence written by her husband drew Gabriella into the darkness of the past. She realized that her husband's death wasn't an accident, but the result of a murder. As she unraveled each thread of truth, Gabriella's fear and anxiety grew, and she thought a malevolent ghost had enveloped every corner of the house. As the night progressed, a strange coldness began to spread through the room, and even breathing became difficult for Gabriella. A shadow slowly emerged from the darkness in one corner of the room. Gabriella rubbed her eyes, questioning reality, but as the shadow became more realistic, she faced her terror. The shadow resembled a silhouette of her lost husband. Gabriella felt as though the eyes in the darkness were staring at her. She reached out towards the shadow with trembling hands, but when her hand touched the emptiness, she panicked. The shadow began to fill every corner of the room, closing in on Gabriella. Whispering voices echoed in her ears, and Gabriella felt the shadow was ready to consume her. Suddenly, a sharp smell filled the room, and the shadow vanished abruptly. Gabriella looked around her room, breathless, but saw nothing. With trembling hands, she reopened the notebook and reread each sentence her husband had written. Although it was difficult to face the truth, Gabriella was now ready to accept the reality of her husband's death. After taking a deep breath and closing her eyes, she quickly left her room and began searching every corner of the house. But she found no shadow or other entity. She was only met with silence and darkness. Gabriella began to think her imagination was playing tricks on her. The impact of the incident might have made her lose her grip on reality. Before dawn, exhausted and frightened, she returned to her bed. When her eyes closed, she felt a sense of peace and slowly drifted off to sleep. However, something happened that night to prove the shadow had indeed been in her room. When she woke up, her husband's notebook was on the edge of the bed. Inside, there was a new message. Find the truth, it read. Gabriella closed the notebook and decided to leave her room, determined to seek the truth. She decided to reach out to detectives to learn more about her husband's death. The mysterious notebook left behind was only the beginning of a dangerous adventure Gabriella embarked on to uncover the secrets of her husband's mysterious death. To her, taking the risks needed to discover the truth was the only way to avenge the man she loved. She had now entered an irreversible path and had to face her fears. Gabriella was determined to uncover the truth behind her husband's death by following the clues in the old notebook. But with each step, she felt herself being drawn deeper into a dark labyrinth. The writings in her husband's notebook led her into a world she had never known before. Following the directions in the notebook, Gabriella reached a crevice one night. A deafening silence prevailed, and she deeply felt the coldness spreading around. As she reached into the crevice, she heard the echo of a distant voice buried in the mist. As she dangerously advanced, the reflections from the broken mirrors were horrific and surreal. Taking a deep breath, Gabriella continued into the darkness of the crevice and suddenly encountered a silhouette. The figure, staring at her with bruised eyes, began to reveal the secrets her husband had left behind. The truths were beyond Gabriella's darkest nightmares. Gabriella learned that her husband was actually a victim of a family curse. The curse was a legacy passed down from his family's past, and his death was being manipulated as a result of this curse. As hard as it was to believe, the entity told Gabriella that if she tried to save her husband, her own soul would be at risk. Gabriella found herself in a complete turmoil. She had to choose between her own life and her husband's ghost. Entering the curse, she realized that the truths were not simple. She had fallen into a dark and merciless world. Yet, she was determined to fight for her love. In the end, no matter the cost, Gabriella entered the curse to save her husband. Standing at the center of a dark and mysterious ritual, she disappeared amid a violent light and echoed screams rising from the surrounding mist. Gabriella's story ended that night, and no one ever learned what happened. Only an empty notebook and an aged atmosphere remained in the house. But after that night, people around the house began to feel something disturbing. Strange occurrences spread among the household after the old notebook was opened, and the terrifying effect of the curse spread to every corner of the house. Gabriella's story became legendary among the people, and the house was remembered as a mysterious place. Though no one knew the full truth, it was believed that ghostly traces still lingered in the house. Gabriella's husband's ghost was said to still roam within the house. As rumors of ghostly traces increased, the house became an unforgettable legend. The brave would silently walk around the house at night, swearing they heard the ghost's sorrowful cries. Some believed the house was cursed, and that those who entered would never come out. One night, only a fearless hunter approached the house's door. Hoping to see the legendary ghost with his own eyes, he stepped inside with unwavering courage. But inside, he encountered an unexpected surprise. All the rooms were empty, and silence prevailed. In a corner, however, an old notebook lay glued to the floor. The hunter began to flip through the notebook. As he turned the pages, he read the last writings of the husband and understood his tragic story more deeply. At that moment, a shadow passed before his eyes, trying to seize the notebook. The hunter held the notebook tightly and stepped back, making eye contact with the shadow. Whether the shadow was the husband's ghost or something else, no one knew. But the deep sorrow and helplessness reflected in its eyes managed to move the hunter. He extended the notebook to the shadow and wanted to hear the husband's last words. The shadow took the notebook, flipped through the pages, then turned to the hunter and silently nodded. Suddenly, a strange and eerie vibration was felt inside the house. The walls began to shake, and ghostly traces appeared within the rooms. The hunter and the shadow moved together in fear and reached the entrance of the house. Outside, a light appeared in the sky, enveloping the house. All the ghostly traces and the dark shadow trembled and vanished. The mist around the house dissipated, revealing a bright morning sky. The hunter and the shadow made eye contact for a while. Then the hunter quietly took the notebook and thanked the shadow. The shadow nodded once more and smiled slightly before silently disappearing into the air. As the hunter stepped outside the house, he was enveloped by the surrounding silence. He felt that the house was no longer cursed and that the ghost of the past had found peace. That night, the legend of the house ended, and peace returned to the quiet town. Gabriella's story would now live only in memories and the pages of the old notebook. But the traces of the curse and the ghost would remain an unforgettable legacy. Thank you for listening.